After the end of George Washington's two four-year terms as the first president of the United States, where he officially served as a nonpartisan, the two-party system emerged with two major rival political parties vying for control. This is most likely due to most states having a winner-take-all approach to the Electoral College, meaning the top vote getter in most states receives all of that state's delegates, regardless of the actual proportion of votes cast for their rivals. In contrast, most countries with a multi-party system of democracy tend to allocate electoral votes based on proportion, giving more opportunity to smaller third parties to gain representation. However, most of the time, small third parties end up having to form a coalition with one of the two dominant parties, thus creating the same effect as we see in the US's two-party system. Regardless of how you feel about the two-party system, we can give a historical account to how the main parties have been supplanted or evolved with the times. Major historical events along the way caused changes in the platform and constituents of the parties seismic enough that we can split the history into seven separate systems. So beginning with the first party system, which lasted from 1796 to 1824, we saw the Federalists, which were led by Alexander Hamilton, versus the Democratic Republicans, which were led by Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists were mainly businessmen, while the Democratic Republicans were mainly farmers. Federalists were dominant in New England, while Democratic Republicans controlled the rest of the 13 colonies and the Ohio Valley. The two parties monopolized power through controlling the limited newspaper outlets at the time. The Federalists supported the creation of a central bank and standing army, while the Democratic Republicans opposed this. In conflict between England and France, the Federalists pragmatically supported England due to them being our largest trading partner, while the Democratic Republicans supported the French Revolution because of their Republican ideals. After the U.S. was invaded by England during the War of 1812, though, a sense of nationalism and unity fell over America, which is called the Era of Good Feelings. This was because the two parties stopped bitterly fighting each other. With the central bank already created and a renewed distrust in the British, the Federalists began to lose members. With no real competition, the Democratic Republicans too began to disintegrate. So that disintegration began the second party system, which lasted from 1824 to 1856. With the Federalists now obsolete, the Democratic Republicans split into two parties. The Democratic Party, which was a left populist party led by Andrew Jackson, and the Conservative National Republican Party led by John Quincy Adams. The Democrats wanted to greatly expand democracy in the U.S. by removing requirements to own property to vote. The National Republicans feared that expanding the voting age population beyond the elite would threaten the development and trajectory of the country. During the 1820s, the first third party emerged, the far-right anti-Masonic Party. While they opposed expanding suffrage to non-property holders, their main issue was a fanatic opposition to the Freemasons, who they viewed as a shadowy group conspiracy. After John Quincy Adams and the National Republicans were defeated by Andrew Jackson, they merged with the anti-Masonic Party to form the Whig Party, led by Henry Clay. The Whigs were strong in Appalachia in New England. Democrats supported popular sovereignty and the voice of the people, while Whigs supported the rule of law and minority rights. Democrats supported Manifest Destiny, which included the Mexican-American War and the removal of Eastern natives. They worked to end the original national bank, and Jackson set up a robust spoilage system for his political friends. Democrats tended to be poorer, less educated whites, whose main goal was to obtain more representation in property. To facilitate this, they supported expansion and settlement of the frontier. The Panic of 1837 was a stock market crash caused by excessive speculation in frontier land values, occurring during Jackson's Democratic successor, Martin Van Buren's term. The crash was a result of Jackson's poor Treasury policies. Interestingly, Van Buren did not necessarily agree with many of Jackson's populist ideas and mainly supported him because his ultimate goal was to reestablish a two-party system. This ushered in a short era of Whig popularity. Soon, however, the Democratic goals of Manifest Destiny overtook Whig conservatism, and the main issue became not whether to expand west, but whether to allow slavery in the new land. Both the Democrats and Whigs had ended up having an odd mix of pro versus anti-slavery voices that could not agree with another. In 1848, abolitionists from the Democrats and Whigs left to form the Free Soil Party, led by Martin Van Buren. The party had the goal of banning slavery in new territories. While the Democrats and Whigs remained the dominant parties, the most radical abolitionists remained and opposed any compromises. With the Democrats swelling in popularity, the remaining conservative Whigs left in 1856 to join the Know Nothing Party, led by Millard Fillmore, another xenophobic third party that was opposed to the immigration and organization of Catholicism in the U.S. in reaction to new Irish and other immigrants. This was in line with past elitist policies of the Whigs. Because of this, Irish Catholics joined the Democrats en masse. By 1960, xenophobia against Catholics had calmed somewhat, and the Know Nothing Party was replaced with the conservative Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell, with the express goal of keeping the Union together, regardless of the question of slavery. In the end, the Democratic goals of the era of expansion and immigration occurred, while the Whig goals of economic development also occurred. So this faltering of the Whigs and their subsequent parties led to the third party system, which lasted from 1856 to 1896. By the time of the Civil War, the liberals of the Free Soil Party had coalesced around a new party, the Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln. Republicans were seen as radical, and with Lincoln's election, the South seceded. After the North won the Civil War, the Republicans claimed victory and got to greatly influence the country following the war during what was called the Reconstruction era. Reconstruction saw the abolition of slavery and giving the right to vote to newly freed blacks. In addition to abolitionism, the Republicans carried forward the business mindset of the Whigs and sought to develop the backwards plantation economy south. They did this by having many Northerners called carpetbaggers move south to start industries and build new infrastructure. The Republicans also supported the development of a land-grant university system. After the most remaining liberal Northerners had become Republicans, Republican influence in the South increased right after the war due to an influx of carpetbaggers and free blacks, but this was undone over the next 10 years with the establishment of slave codes in the South known as Jim Crow laws, which discriminated against blacks and ensured they remained poor and in fear. This started a long Democratic dominance in the South called the Solid South. During this time, Republicans were liberals and Democrats were dominated by the conservative Southern Bourbon Democrats, who were joined by Northern Catholics known as Copperheads. Following the end of slavery, the battle between Catholic and Protestant influence reemerged. Protestant Republicans increasingly tried to find new reforms to better the country's moral standing, while the Catholic Democrats pushed back against such religious rigidity. While Democrats saw many losses during this period, their candidate Grover Cleveland was able to win by campaigning against tariffs. At the time, the Republicans began to push tariffs hard as a way to stimulate domestic production. The harm of the tariffs was not fully understood, but the Democrats were able to find some success in pointing out the fact that the burden fell on the people. Cleveland's popularity was undercut by the Panic of 1893, which was caused by an international collapse of investments in the faltering Argentinian economy, which was one of the world's largest at the time. This led to the election of Republican William McKinley in a landslide victory. While economic prosperity began to return to the rapidly industrializing Northeast and its wealthy businessmen, the prosperity did not return for most agrarian-focused Americans and immigrants. This period was known as the Gilded Age. Anarchism and populism began to reemerge. William Jennings Bryan was able to seize on this and take control of the Democratic Party. His goal was to take back power from big business by stepping away from the exclusionary gold standard to a more open silver standard. Many saw the silver standard as reckless, and the establishment opposed it. So at the end of the third party system, for the most of this was Republican and Northern dominance and a weak Democratic Party. By 1896, we emerged into the fourth party system, which lasted until 1932. With back-to-back Republican winnings and a dedication to the gold standard, the economy was back on track by 1900. The assassination of McKinley by an angry anarchist led to the election of the popular liberal Republican Theodore Roosevelt. During this time, the Republican voting bloc was increasingly held together by more and more destructive tariffs. A liberal populist sect of Republicans led by Roosevelt emerged to begin to question the increasing power of the big businesses that their party was catering to. These progressive Republicans teamed up with the Democrats to protect workers' rights, creating the Progressive Era. This infighting in the Republican Party allowed progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson to win. After Wilson became president, the progressive sect of the Republicans diminished in power, and the party became even more dominated by pro-business interests. Following World War I and Woodrow Wilson's strong interventionism, many Americans turned back to the more protectionist Republicans. It was not until several back-to-back pro-business Republican administrations with unchecked economic growth did we suffer the worst financial crash in history in 1929. This saw a rapid erosion in public confidence in the Republicans in the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which began the fifth party system, which from 1932 to 1980. FDR and the Democrats seized power and expanded the federal government to an unprecedented level. Because of strong populist policies and a sense of success at tackling the Great Depression, Democrats also maintained their voting bloc to include both the South, who had greatly benefited from the New Deal modernization programs, as well as large parts of the industrialized North, which were made of immigrants and began to more closely be aligned to trade unions. In reaction to Democrats' big tent policy success, Republicans fractured again into a conservative and progressive wing. Progressive Republicans were longstanding Republicans from New England who supported business development and civil rights. Northern Democrats also tended to be progressive and support civil rights, although with a greater emphasis on the worker. As Southern blacks began to migrate out of the South as part of the Great Migration to Northern factory jobs, they too joined the pro-worker Democrat Party of the North. The Southern Democrats, meanwhile, remained opposed to civil rights, yet supported government intervention when it came to welfare. The newly emboldened conservative Republicans hailed mostly from the West, with a libertarian view that was viewed as more radical because it opposed many of the welfare policies that were established by the New Deal. Many Southern Democrats saw this conservatism as a calling back to old times or a yearning to keep things the way it is, and in their context, that was opposing the integration of the South. Southern Democrats began to break away from the party, first as a protest and then as a permanent shift to a conservative camp, despite their continued reliance on welfare programs. After FDR and then Harry S. Truman in World War II and the Korean War, Americans began to become fatigued of interventionism and elected war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower, who promised to turn the focus back domestically with an emphasis on the development of the interstate highway system. By the end of his term, Eisenhower was increasingly calling attention to the issue of the dominance of the American military-industrial complex and put the Republicans in an anti-interventionist camp. Following World War II, both parties were extremely fearful of the rise of communism. The Democrats saw communism as dominoes waiting to fall as they reverberated out from the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Republicans began to believe the communist threat existed domestically in the form of Hollywood leftists and university students. Many conservatives also saw the election of Catholic Democrat JFK to be an embarrassment and an overfocus of America on good looks and celebrity status. His inexperience during the Cuban Missile Crisis put our country in great danger, but his reputation was restored following his assassination. One of his causes of his administration was to take over French efforts in Vietnam to stop a communist takeover. LBJ used this opportunity to drastically scale up military intervention in Vietnam by staging the Gulf of Tonkin incident with the primary goal of enriching himself off the sale of helicopters. This system's civil rights began under Harry S. Truman when he took efforts to desegregate the military following World War II. Eisenhower, JFK, and LBJ all furthered the cause of civil rights, which was seen as crucial for receiving the liberal vote. The supporting of civil rights also provided a convenient distraction from the other problems of the time. LBJ's distinct disregard for human life and unnecessary military intervention for the purpose of self-enrichment is often overlooked by his Great Society policies. By the time of Nixon, most Americans were tired of the war, the constant protests and riots, and they wanted a return to a moderate conservative normalcy. Nixon ended the war and turned his international stance to accepting communist countries such as China into the global community. He addressed the extreme domestic issues of the time, which were horrible pollution, by creating the EPA. On a personal level, Nixon was paranoid and felt the need to commit a crime to ensure victory for his second term. The Watergate scandal ruined his legacy, led to his resignation, the appointment of Gerald Ford, and the election of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a positive force, but did not know much about how to handle the pressing issues abroad. Failure to negotiate the release of American hostages in Iran and a national fuel shortage at the time that happened to coincide hurt his popularity. Carter had won by obtaining essentially all the Democratic vote, from the conservatives in the South to the progressives in the North. The progressive leaders in Congress clashed with Carter for being too conservative, allowed a rival bid for Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy to occur, although it was ultimately unsuccessful. A Democratic civil war between conservatives and progressives made them weak and allowed Ronald Reagan to sweep the nation. And that sweeping conservative win for the next decade. It was what ushered in the six-party system, which lasted from 1980 to 2016. Reagan, while not being a populist, was naturally very popular among the American public for being an ex-movie star and was seen as not being connected to the tainted Nixon administration. Reagan mixed his conservative religious beliefs to bring a new group of voting bloc, the Christian right, who up until this point did not feel threatened, as most Americans were still Christian and still went to church. They seek to stop the decline in church membership they saw as detrimental to their faith. While promoting these ideals, Reagan also brought a personal sense of interventionism that was previously not seen in the Republican Party. His administration believed the USSR was on its last legs and that a strong and active American military would help put it out of its misery and allow the US to become the sole global superpower. His VP and successor, George H.W. Bush, continued this mix of ideology, now known as neoconservatism. During the 1980s and the reaction to the 70s oil crisis and shortage, Persian Gulf states began to increase production. No country increased production more than Kuwait, which is beginning to receive warnings from OPEC, a group which they are a member of. This overproduction caused what is called the oil glut of the 80s, when oil prices became extremely low. Iraq, currently in a deadlocked war with Iran, was a petrostate and was having their economy actively crushed by the war and drop in oil prices it blamed on the Kuwaiti overproduction. After accusing the Kuwaitis of slant drilling and invading and occupying Kuwait, most of the world responded negatively, and a large coalition force struck the occupied territory in Operation Desert Storm, part of what is known as the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq then decided to strike Israel with missiles and chemical weapons in hopes that Israel would retaliate, and the rest of the Arab nations, who were all against Saddam's aggression, would back out of the coalition. The U.S. convinced the Israelis not to respond, and Saddam's annexation was foiled. As the Iraqi soldiers retreated, they destroyed all Kuwaiti oil infrastructure they could, causing the oil shock of 1990, a recession which, coinciding with Bush breaking his promise not to increase taxes, led to Democrat Bill Clinton getting elected in 1992. The Democratic Civil War would continue until into the early 2000s, with Bill Clinton being the last gasp for the conservative Democrats, who had controlled the Solid South for the last 130-some years. With the election of George W. Bush, another neocon, both major parties were beginning to blend together on foreign policy, allowing the Bush administration to get away with invading Iraq and executing Saddam Hussein in an effort to stop them from ditching the U.S. dollar to trade in oil. The Great Recession, blamed in part on Bush, allowed Democrat Barack Obama to win in 2008, who largely continued the liberal policies of previous administrations with a slight progressive tilt. The dwindling of any fiscally responsible voice in Washington led to the conservative moment known as the Tea Party, seeing the Republican Party become more radical and unwilling to compromise. These effects of the Tea Party, though, is also kind of seen as a last gasp for the fiscally responsible wing of the Republican Party. And this is what led, the collapse of the Tea Party is what led into the seventh party system, which began in 2016 and is continuing today. By 2016, both parties they're very similar in their liberal views for the outward world, but they clash at home on how progressive or conservative they should be. The Democrats, who had since FDR courted the unions, began to see white working class members drift away from the party because of the rise of Donald Trump. Trump, seeing an opening, brought a brand of isolationist populism that filled the void. Bipartisan free trade agreements such as NAFTA had helped many aspects of the U.S. economy grow tremendously, but also did have the effect of making American manufacturing less competitive, shedding jobs, and ending a way of life for many. Many of these poor whites, who had traditionally been Democrats, came flocking with promises to decrease American military and foreign spending. The neocon tribe began to die out quickly, causing even more liberal members of the Republican Party to leave. At the same time, we are seeing a decrease in the influence of the religious right. At the same time, the Democrats are losing their traditional Catholic base, which includes Hispanics, due to the belief among them that the party is too progressive. Conservative blacks, predominantly males, have also slowly drifted to the Republican Party. Previously Democratic rural areas such as eastern Iowa and western Illinois have transformed completely into solid Republican territory. The rural-urban divide is now the starkest contrast in politics today in the battle of Democrat versus Republican, with the Democrats being increasingly made up of more wealthy coastal liberals in large urban centers, which serve as the global capitalist machines, while the Republicans are increasingly becoming pro-working class, conservative, rural, protectionist party.